Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review on Unit 15, Truman and the Eisenhower years, focusing on civil rights and the Cold War. Looking at the review sheet from top to bottom, the containment idea is the notion that communist aggression needs vigilant and constant and firm counter pressure against it. And this idea originates from a letter written by an American diplomat in Moscow named George Kennan. Basically, the idea is that the Soviets are duplicitous, they're liars, they're aggressive, and that they need a firm, constant response against them. And this is going to lead in Europe to the NATO alliance, this alliance between the Americans, Canadians, and the Western Europeans, that they'll defend each other against Soviet aggression. You have the Truman Doctrine, which is basically giving money to Greece and to Turkey to fight the spread of communism there. And there is a civil war in Greece, which is won by the monarchists against the communists. You have the Berlin Airlift in 1948. The Soviets try to starve out the city of Berlin, several million in this city, many of them refugees deep in the heart of the Soviet zone. And the Berlin blockade is met by this airlift. Basically, the Americans and the Brits fly in supplies for a year, and the idea here is that the West will not buckle to the intimidation and threats of the Red Army. You have the development of the H-bomb, which is sort of the new and better version of the original A-bomb. You have in Asia, you have aid to Chiang Kai-shek in the civil war against Mao, and Mao will win in 1949, and Chiang will flee to the island of Taiwan. And the United States, to this day, defends Taiwan with the 7th Fleet. There's aid to the South Vietnamese government after the French leave in 1954, and of course before that the United States is basically funding a good chunk of the war from 45 to 54 that the French fight against the Vietnamese communists. And then of course the United States sends troops under the aegis of the United Nations. It's a declared police action, but from 1950 to 53 the United States is fighting the North Korean communists and the Chinese quote-unquote volunteers, basically the Chinese army. You should be familiar with this metaphor, which is a very powerful idea here, from a speech given in 1946 by Winston Churchill at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in which he says, "From the Baltic to the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." This idea that Europe now is divided into dark and light, slave and free. You should not be familiar, the United States is going to ally itself with countries, some of them not democratic, against what's believed to be the greater evil, and that's communism. And you do have the CIA being involved in supporting the overthrow of some democratic government. Most notably in 1953, you have Mohammad Mossadegh is overthrown in Iran because he's nationalizing the oil fields, and nationalizing is something that communists do. The guy wasn't a communist, he was just a Persian nationalist. And then you have 1954, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala is overthrown by the military with CIA connivance because he's nationalizing some of the agricultural land, these banana plantations owned by companies like Del Monte and Dole and United Fruit. Washington's farewell address, how is this obsolete at this point in American history? Remember, Washington famously, when he's stepping down, he says to Americans, stay out of foreign entanglement, stay out of foreign affairs, in particular European affairs. And we have a 180-degree pivot here where we're deeply involved. We've got an army that stays in Europe, and we're loaning money. And by the way, under what we're doing in Europe, you have the Marshall Plan, which is the giving of money, the loaning of money to the Europeans to rebuild their broken economies. Years after World War II is over, much of Europe is still, particularly places like Germany, are still in rubble and in ruins, and there is hunger, there is unemployment, and the Soviets have some strong credibility. Communism has some appeal. It's promising work, it's promising economic revitalization, and the Soviets did much of the heavy work. They broke the back of the German army. So the thinking is there has to be a counter appeal here by American aid, and that's the Marshall Plan, or officially the European Recovery Act. In the Middle East, you should be aware, in 1948, the nation of Israel is created by the United Nations. They actually declare independence unilaterally, and immediately they go to war against the Arab League, and the Israelis, amazingly, hold off the armies of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq and Yemen. Not all of these countries are sending huge contingents, but it's a very decisive Israeli victory. And in 1956, you have what's called the Suez Crisis. Nasser, who is the president, dictator of Egypt, is going to nationalize the Suez Canal, which at this point is still controlled by the Brits. They have a deal they're supposed to leave sometime in the 1960s, but Nasser, to sort of cement his credentials as being the leading Arab nationalist leader, nationalizes the canal, and he is going to, at the same time, block the Straits of Tiran, which is the choke point there for the Gulf of Aqaba, which is that body of water between the Sinai Peninsula and the bottom part of Israel and Saudi Arabia. And he's going to close the Suez Canal to Israel, and he's going to saber rattle. And what this is going to bring is an attack by the Israelis against Egypt, and there's going to be British paratroopers are going to paratroop into Port Said, which is the main city in the Suez Canal area. And you have French troops land, and it's this three-part agreement. Why are the French mad? Well, the French are angry that Nasser is providing military aid to Algerian rebels against the French in French Algeria. And this whole thing comes to a close. Eisenhower is alarmed that, first of all, the Americans haven't been notified here by our allies, but Eisenhower is alarmed. Khrushchev is threatening to bomb London, threatening to bomb Paris, to land troops in Syria. Eisenhower is afraid that World War III is going to break out over this Suez crisis, and he basically pulls the economic leash on the Brits and the French, who are dependent on American aid for really for everything, for their economic sustenance at this time. And it basically shows the end of the Europeans as being able to project power on their own, and shows the power of the United States. Simultaneously, in 1956, there's another crisis happening in Europe, and the Soviets are going to invade Budapest. They're going to invade Hungary because Imre Nagy, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, M-A-G-Y, I think I've heard it Nagy, Imre Nagy is the leader of Hungary, and he's breaking off relations with the Warsaw Pact. That's the counterpart to NATO. And he is allowing freedoms. He's talking about allowing multi-party elections. There's student protests in the streets, which lead to civilian protests. And it looks like Hungary is breaking away, and the Soviets send in 100,000 troops. Mostly it's Warsaw Pact troops officially, but it's mostly the Soviets and their tanks. And they crushed this revolution. But the concentration of the world is not, it's distracted by what's going on down in Egypt, and the Soviets are able to portray themselves as defenders of the Third World and of those seeking independence, guys like Nasser, against imperialist colonialist bullies like the Brits and the French. 1957, you have what's called the Eisenhower Doctrine. Eisenhower is basically going to commit to American defense of the Middle East against the spread of communism. In 1957, the President Eisenhower, sends troops to Lebanon in a civil war, which he fears is the communists are going to use this to overthrow the government of Lebanon. The Red Scare, you should be familiar with this. Remember, there's an earlier Red Scare in the 1920s, but this is, and you'll know the Red Scares by context. The Red Scare is this fear of communist subversion in the United States, and you have Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin famously leading a Senate investigating committee, and he's forcing testimony, and he is bringing in suspected communists or people who know communists or who once were communists, and he's accusing them, and there's defamation, and he's bullying them, and he doesn't uncover any communists, and a lot of people's careers are ruined. In the House, you have the House Un-American Affairs Committee, HUAC, led, one of the guys on the leading person you need to know is Richard Nixon from California, and he's going to uncover a spy that was deep, high up in the State Department called Alger Hiss. Now, this is a guy who was appeared to be so squeaky clean that many people supported him. But Richard Nixon earns his chops here in tenaciously going after Alger Hiss and exposing, but they never conclusively prove at this time that he was a spy, but they prove that he perjured himself, that he did not know Whittaker Chambers, who was a communist at one time. You should be familiar with some laws here. The Smith Act, this is pre-1950s. This is, I think, 1940 vintage law that says you can't advocate the overthrow of the United States government. This is going to be used as a hammer against these small groups of American radicals. You have the loyalty review boards under Truman, which federal employees have to take loyalty oaths. You have the McCarran Internal Security Act, which requires that communist organizations register with the Attorney General, and it sets up a subversive activities control board, which has the power to investigate socialist and communist and union groups that are ostensibly revolutionary and directed by Moscow. You should also be familiar, this whole thing starts when Joseph MacArthur is giving a speech at a Republican Women's Club in Wheeling, West Virginia, and waves a piece of paper, and he says he's got a list of 100+ communists that are in the State Department that are being coddled. And this is going to sort of be the trigger that leads to this great sort of wave of fear in the United States and support for McCarthy until he goes after the Army. And at this point, his star plummets, and he's going to be censured eventually by the Senate for his verbal and investigatory abuse. As far as the civil rights in the 1950s, you'll be familiar with the phrase the Double V campaign. This idea comes out of some African-American magazine during the war, which says that blacks are fighting two wars. They're fighting a war against tyranny abroad with the United States against the Empire of Japan and the fascists and the Nazis. But there's this racism at home that remains to be defeated. So it's this larger idea that there's some hypocrisy in fighting for freedom elsewhere when we don't have it at home, and the expectation is that this racism should end. Martin Luther King Jr.'s strategy, and he's the most famous of the many leaders of the civil rights movement, he advocated peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience. This guy's a Baptist minister, and he's modeling his behavior in the face of Jim Crow on Jesus, who did not retaliate when he was crucified on the cross. And this idea of Christian pacifism, it's not just the reason why Christ died, but it's how he died, should be modeled. This peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience. And this is basically bought by most of these various groups. You've got CORE, you've got SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then you have the SCLC, the Southern Christians Leadership Conference. These groups are all advocating nonviolence. And some examples of this: 1955, you have the famous Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks won't get out of her seat. You have the 1957 Little Rock Central High integration, where the Little Rock Nine are going to, very bravely, they're going to walk the halls and they're going to go to class. That's an example of nonviolent protests in the face of those who don't want them. And getting out of we're crossing over into the 1960s here, but 1960 you have the Woolworth counter sit-ins in Greensboro. You have the 1961 Freedom Riders that are testing the court ban on interstate segregation in interstate buses. You have the 1962-63 Birmingham protests and boycotts against white businesses and the protests and getting beat up by the police and under Bull Connor. You have the 1963 March on Washington, that march that leads to that I Have a Dream speech. So these are all protests and marches and speaking and sit-ins and boycotting of buses and white businesses. These are all things that fall under non-violent, peaceful civil disobedience. Federal government actions in support of civil rights. You have the 1954 Brown versus School Board decision, 9-0. The Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is inherently unequal, overturning the Plessy versus Ferguson 1896 ruling that said separate but equal was okay. You have the 1957 Little Rock school incident where Orville Faubus is going to defy the integration of this Little Rock High School, and President Eisenhower, is going to call out the Screaming Eagles, the paratroops, and they're not coming out of the sky, they're coming from the Air Force Base down the road, but they're sent to escort the Little Rock Nine to their classes, well, to the school and to their classes in Little Rock. Economic growth after World War II, some examples, and why is there this growth? You have just some buzzwords, some things to think about here, some reasons why there's growth. There's this baby boom. 15 million young men are coming back, and they're getting married, and they're having babies. And there's this explosion. There's this confidence. Okay, we're not in the Depression anymore. There are jobs. There's pent-up demand. Autobiographical note, my father was a soldier, World War II, came home, married mom, and boom, 4 kids, 4-bedroom, 2-bath home in a suburb. The world was good. And it's baby boom. You got pent-up demand. You've got the United States untouched by war. We're not broken like Europe is. A lot of research and development coming from government investments and government support. You've got investment in infrastructure. The interstate highway system is being built. Schools are being built for all these little kids. You have the GI Bill, where the government is sending young men who were in the military off to college or to trade school. Dad went on the GI Bill and became a chemical engineer, later a college prof. This is all very good investment for the government. You have the first use of credit cards. People are able to buy more stuff than they really have money for. You have unions. About 1/3 of Americans are in unions, and there are some historians that are calling this period of the 50s the Great Compression. This is you had the smallest gap between those on the bottom and those on the top. And I tell the story to my class. Next door neighbor to my dad, who was a college prof and chemical engineer, PhD, and all that, was a guy who was a foreman at the Willow Run auto factory, a couple miles down the road in Ypsilanti, and you could have a good life if you were in a union. You could have a house in a middle-class neighborhood, and the Great Compression, wealth was distributed. You had new products. You have your first computers. You have transistors. You have LPs. You have television. Some ways you see this growth. You see the physical kids running around in schools. You see highways being built. You've got the crabgrass frontier, which is the nickname for suburbia, these Levittowns, these massive subdivisions. I lived in one of those subdivisions. You've got cars. People are buying cars and consumer goods. And again, TVs in every house, sort of the counterpart to radios in the 1920s. So this is really a boom decade. Probably the closest counterpart would be the 1920s. This idea of conformity, consensus, and contentment. This idea that Americans are kind of all on the same page. This is a time without a lot of dissent, without a lot of internal division. And to a certain extent, you could argue this: women are at home raising children. Women are, they've left their factory jobs. You have people moving to suburbia. You have people having children. By and large, Americans are anti-communist. They're standing behind the government, resisting the spread of communism overseas. This is a very religious decade. Huge numbers of people are going to church. Churches are being built, and church schools are being built. It's a time of patriotism and a time of optimism. Life is measurably getting better for the middle class. Children are making more than their parents. And you see these TV shows, you see these westerns, which are sort of stand-ins for us against the communists, whites against the Indians. You've got these TV shows about these ideal families with the go-to-work dad and the stay-at-home mom and the happy, mischievous children, Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy, Father Knows Best, and such. One of the favorite TV shows was Archbishop Fulton Sheen's Life is Worth Living. You've got this bishop in his regalia with a blackboard and chalk, and he's on Sunday night. He's talking to the American public, and people are reading this stuff up. A lot of support for this civil religion, you might call it. And at the same time here, you do have dissent. You have Michael Harrington's The Other America, in which he is going to write about that fifth of Americans who are still living in poverty and slums in the American South and Appalachia, both poor white and poor black. You have Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Now keep in mind, this is a 1963 book, so if you're writing about the 50s, really she's reflecting on the 1950s. That's how I would tie her book to the 50s. But this idea that men have brainwashed women, that women have been kept out of meaningful lives, kept out of school, kept out of workplaces. You have Hugh Hefner and Alfred Kinsey pushing this sexual revolution, with Hefner's Playboy magazine and the Kinsey reports, which are going to do this research, and they're going to say that what Americans say is perverse and kinky is really normal, is really mainstream. You've got movie stars like Marlon Brando in The Wild One and James Dean in Rebels Without a Cause, or Rebel Without a Cause, and these rootless rebel young men who are, have no place, have anxiety, and are frustrated with this middle-class bourgeois existence. You've got your beatniks. You've got Allen Ginsberg's Howl, this poem about basically taking drugs. You've got Jack Kerouac, who is this sort of rebel beatnik writer on the road. These buddies traveling around the country, going to Mexico, and just kind of hanging out. In art, you've got your op art, you've got your pop art, you've got Andy Warhol, and with his criticism of middle class, lowbrow taste, he paints soup cans, Campbell soup cans, and he paints Mickey Mouse, and he paints Marilyn Monroe. Some of these books here, counterparts of the sort of lost young men. You've got Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. You've got Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman with his Willie Loman. Okay, will everybody be successful if they strive? Well, Willie Loman isn't. You've got Sloan Wilson's Man in a Gray Flannel Suit, this guy who, one day just can't take it anymore. He's going off to work. He's a drone. So you should be familiar about, these what appears to be true on the surface, this consensus, this contentment, and this conformity, and the dissent below. And of course, the Black Civil Rights Movement is a huge, huge movement of dissent. And lastly, just some thoughts on this 1948 election. Really a remarkable election. The Democratic Party is going to split three ways, and they're going to win the election. Remember, the Democrats are going to win in 1912 because the Republicans split. Republicans split two ways, and then you have the Democrats lose because they split two ways in 1860, and Lincoln will win. And here are the Democrats predicted to lose because you have winning the nomination for the Democrats is going to be Harry Truman, who wins over Dewey, but you have Henry Wallace, who's going to get somewhere around the region of 2 million votes for his Progressive Party. This is a party that basically says we're as guilty as the Soviets. We're basically saber-rattling, and we need to focus more on domestic spending and not so much on the military. And you have Strom Thurmond, and he's the leader of what are called the Dixiecrats, the States' Rights Party, and he's also getting about 2 million votes, and we're looking at about 2.5% of the vote. Wallace and Strom Thurmond are going to lose, and Strom Thurmond's platform is racism, segregation, defiance forever against the civil rights movement. So there's some thoughts here on essentially the 1950s, the post-war years, the last years of the 40s, the 50s, and some of the early years of the 60s. So next unit we'll pick up on the 1960s and get into the Vietnam War. All right, study well, study smart, and signing out.